More than 3 millennia ago, long before history was written to be questioned, corrected, or cross-examined, the ancient world was ruled by something far more powerful than facts: authority carved in stone. In this era, truth did not belong to those who proved it, but to those who could immortalize it in temples, reliefs, and sacred texts, guarded by priests and enforced by kings who claimed divine blood in their veins. Egypt, at the height of its new kingdom, was such a civilization: rich, centralized, deeply religious, and utterly convinced that its pharaoh was not merely a ruler, but a living god walking among mortals. To challenge Egypt was to challenge the cosmic order itself, a concept known as Ma'at, the balance of the universe. And yet, far to the north, beyond deserts and rivers, another empire had risen that neither feared Egyptian gods nor bowed to Egyptian tradition. This was the Hittite Empire, a sophisticated, militarized power rooted in Anatolia, whose kings ruled not as divine beings, but as pragmatic strategists, masters of diplomacy, intelligence, and war. The collision between these two worldviews was inevitable, and when it came, it would reshape how power, propaganda, and memory itself were wielded. At the center of this coming storm stood Kadesh, a city that, by modern standards, might seem insignificant, yet in the late Bronze Age was one of the most valuable prizes in the Near East. Positioned near the Orontes River, Kadesh controlled trade arteries connecting Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia, serving as both a military gateway and an economic choke point. Whoever held Kadesh could project dominance across Syria and intimidate neighboring states into submission or alliance. For decades, Kadesh had been a source of humiliation for Egypt, slipping from its grasp despite earlier victories under pharaohs like Thutmose III. Each loss gnawed at Egyptian prestige, each failure whispered doubt into the myth of invincibility. To the Hittites, however, Kadesh was not just a fortress. It was a shield, a buffer zone protecting the heart of their empire from southern expansion. Thus, the city became more than territory. It became a symbol of supremacy, and symbols in the ancient world were worth rivers of blood. When Ramses II ascended the Egyptian throne, he inherited not only a vast empire, but an enormous expectation. Young, energetic, and acutely aware that legitimacy in Egypt was forged through monumental achievements, Ramses understood that peace did not inspire awe, conquest did. His reign began under the shadow of his father, Seti I, a capable ruler who had campaigned in Syria but failed to secure lasting control over Kadesh. To Ramesses, this unresolved conflict was an open wound and an opportunity. Reclaim Kadesh, and his name would echo alongside the greatest warrior pharaohs of history. Fail, and his reign would risk being remembered as hollow grandeur without substance. Determined to prove both his military genius and divine favor, Ramesses framed his campaign not merely as a political necessity, but as a sacred mission ordained by the gods themselves. Preparations for war were immense. Egypt mobilized one of the largest armies it had ever fielded, carefully organized into 4 massive divisions, each named after a powerful deity: Amun, Ra, Ptah, and Set, reinforcing the idea that this was not just an army of men, but an army backed by the heavens. Thousands of infantrymen marched alongside elite chariot units, their bronze weapons gleaming under the sun, their shields painted with symbols of divine protection. Priests accompanied the troops, performing rituals to secure favor from the gods, while scribes documented every stage of the march, already crafting the narrative of victory before a single blow had been struck. Confidence was absolute, bordering on fatal arrogance, because Egypt had learned to believe its own myths, that no force could withstand the pharaoh when he marched in righteousness. Yet while Egypt marched north in grand procession, the Hittite king Muwatalli II prepared in silence. Unlike Ramesses, Muwatalli did not need glory carved into temples. He needed results. He relocated his capital temporarily to better control the theater of war, assembled a coalition of vassal states, and gathered an army that rivaled and possibly exceeded the Egyptian force in size. Most importantly, he understood something that would define the coming battle. Information was a weapon. Hittite scouts tracked Egyptian movements meticulously, studying their pace, their formations, and their reliance on assumptions rather than verification. Muwatalli chose the battlefield not where honor demanded, but where deception would flourish, using Kadesh itself and the surrounding terrain as tools of misdirection. As the Egyptian army advanced deeper into enemy-controlled territory, stretched thin along long supply lines, a dangerous illusion took hold, the belief that the Hittites were afraid. Reports suggested that Muwatalli was retreating north, unwilling to face Ramses in open battle. To the young pharaoh, this confirmed everything he believed about himself, that the mere presence of Egypt's king was enough to scatter his enemies. What Ramses could not see, and what history would later reveal with cruel clarity, was that this confidence was not earned. It was manufactured, carefully planted by an enemy who understood that the most devastating blow is the one delivered when the target is convinced it is already winning. And with that illusion firmly in place, the stage was set for a battle that would not only test armies, but redefine how power lies, quite literally, could be etched into eternity. As Ramses II advanced toward Kadesh, his army stretched across miles of dust-choked roads, banners snapping in the desert wind, priests chanting invocations to the gods, and scribes carefully recording what they already believed would be a glorious and straightforward victory. Confidence ruled the Egyptian camp, because confidence had been deliberately engineered. Along the march north, Ramses encountered two wandering Bedouins, who were quickly captured and interrogated, men who claimed, with convincing fear and trembling, that the Hittite king Muwatalli II was far to the north, retreating in panic, unwilling to face the might of Egypt in open battle. This was exactly what Ramses wanted to hear, and that alone should have raised suspicion, yet in the ancient world, intelligence was fragile, slow, and dangerously dependent on trust. What Ramses did not realize was that these men were Hittite agents, planted with precision, trained to lie just well enough to be believed, feeding the pharaoh a narrative that aligned perfectly with his own ambition. Muwatalli, in truth, was not retreating at all. He was already near Kadesh, hidden behind the city and the rolling terrain, commanding an army possibly larger than Ramesses' own, including thousands of elite Hittite chariots, heavier and more destructive than their Egyptian counterparts. While Ramses rushed forward with the Amun division, believing the enemy was distant and disorganized, the rest of his army lagged far behind, dangerously spread out, unaware that the battlefield had already been chosen, not by Egypt, but by the Hittites. The moment of revelation came too late. As Ramses established his camp northwest of Kadesh, his men relaxing, removing armor, tending horses, and preparing for what they assumed would be an uneventful night, Hittite chariots suddenly erupted from concealment like a storm unleashed by the earth itself. Hundreds of them thundered across the plain, iron-shod wheels cutting into flesh and bone, crashing directly into the unprepared Egyptian forces with catastrophic speed. The RA division, marching toward the camp and completely exposed, was hit first and shattered almost instantly. Soldiers trampled, formations collapsing in seconds, messengers slaughtered before they could warn the pharaoh. Panic spread faster than orders, and within moments what had been a proud imperial army dissolved into chaos, with survivors fleeing blindly toward the camp carrying terror. The Egyptian position was on the verge of annihilation. Not a heroic stand, not a glorious clash, but a catastrophic failure of intelligence, command, and overconfidence. Ramesses himself was suddenly isolated, surrounded by enemy chariots, his elite guard overwhelmed, the illusion of divine favor cracking under the weight of reality. According to Egyptian records, and this is where history begins to blur into propaganda, Ramses did not flee. He did not panic. Instead, the inscriptions claim that the pharaoh stood alone, abandoned by his men, calling out to Amun in desperation, accusing the god of betrayal, before receiving sudden divine strength that transformed him into a force of nature. In these accounts, Ramses mounts his chariot and charges again and again into the Hittite ranks, personally slaughtering enemies by the hundreds, driving them into the river, scattering entire armies through sheer godlike fury. Yet, when modern historians strip away the poetic exaggeration and compare Egyptian carvings with Hittite records, a far more sobering picture emerges. Ramses likely fought bravely, yes, but he was saved not by divine intervention, but by the arrival of the Nairene, allied troops from Amurru, and later by the delayed Egyptian divisions that finally reached the battlefield. The Hittites, having overextended themselves during the initial assault and busy looting the Egyptian camp, lost cohesion at the worst possible moment. What followed was not a decisive victory for either side, but a brutal stalemate born from mutual exhaustion, miscalculation, and survival rather than triumph. By nightfall, the battlefield around Kadesh was littered with wrecked chariots, dead horses, broken weapons, and bodies from both empires, while neither side truly controlled the field. Mu'tali withdrew his forces behind the city, unwilling to risk further losses, while Ramesses, battered and far from victorious, lacked the strength to continue the assault or capture Kadesh itself. Strategically, the battle achieved nothing Egypt had set out to accomplish. Kadesh remained in Hittite hands, Egyptian influence in Syria weakened, and the campaign ended without conquest. And yet, when Ramses returned home, history itself was about to be rewritten. What had been, at best, a narrowly avoided disaster would be transformed into one of the most celebrated victories in Egyptian memory. Not through truth, but through stone, poetry, and repetition on a scale the ancient world had never seen before. When chaos finally erupted at Kadesh, it did not do so gradually or with warning, but with the sudden violence of a world collapsing under false assumptions. The Egyptian camp, hastily erected and dangerously exposed, became the epicenter of disaster as Hittite chariots burst from concealment in overwhelming numbers, their heavier frames and three-man crews giving them a brutal advantage over the lighter, faster Egyptian chariot. Dust filled the air, orders dissolved into screams, and formations that had taken months to assemble disintegrated in minutes. The carefully named divisions of the gods meant nothing in the face of surprise, and the divine symmetry of the Egyptian army, so impressive on papyrus and temple walls, proved useless when men were cut down before they could even lift their shields. The pharaoh's strategic gamble had failed, and the consequences were immediate and merciless. Ramses II found himself at the heart of this storm, not as the distant commander of a disciplined host, but as a ruler suddenly confronted with the terrifying possibility of capture or death, an outcome unthinkable in Egyptian ideology. A pharaoh was not meant to be. Yet here he was, isolated near the Orontes River, his guards scattered, enemy chariots circling like predators, and his grand campaign teetering on the edge of total collapse. In this moment, the official Egyptian narrative would later claim that Ramses stood alone, abandoned by his troops, and cried out to the god Ammon in bitter desperation, accusing him of betrayal before receiving divine reassurance and supernatural strength. This dramatic monologue, preserved in what historians call the Poem of Pentar, would become one of the most famous pieces of royal propaganda in ancient history, a text designed not to inform, but to absolve. According to this carefully crafted account, Ramesses mounted his chariot and charged repeatedly into the enemy, striking down countless Hittites with the fury of a god incarnate, driving them into the river and scattering an entire army through sheer divine wrath. The pharaoh is portrayed as the only force standing between Egypt and annihilation, a lone hero whose courage compensates for the failures of his men. Yet the reality, reconstructed through archaeological evidence and Hittite records, is far less miraculous and far more human. Ramses was saved not by divine intervention, but by circumstance. The overextension of Hittite chariots during the initial assault, their distraction with looting the Egyptian camp, and the eventual arrival of reinforcements, Nearan troops, and the delayed Egyptian divisions that finally closed the gap. What followed was not a god's victory, but a desperate stabilization of a battle that should never have unfolded that way in the first place. The most revealing detail lies not in what Egypt claimed, but in what it failed to achieve. By the end of the fighting, Kadesh remained firmly under Hittite control. Egyptian casualties were severe, and the strategic situation in Syria was unchanged or worse for Egypt. Mu'tali II withdrew not because he was defeated, but because he had achieved his primary objective. Halting Egyptian expansion without risking unnecessary losses, Ramses, despite surviving the battle, lacked the strength to press the attack or besiege the city. In modern military terms, the outcome was a Hittite strategic success and an Egyptian failure narrowly disguised as survival. And yet, survival was not enough for a king who claimed to be chosen by the gods. For Ramses II, defeat was not an option, not politically, not theologically, and not personally. A pharaoh who admitted failure risked undermining Ma'at itself, destabilizing the belief that sustained the empire. And so, upon returning to Egypt, Ramses did something unprecedented in scale and audacity. He redefined reality. Across temples from Abu Simbel to Karnak, massive reliefs were carved depicting the battle, always from the same angle, always with the same message. Ramesses alone, towering over enemies, victorious through divine favor. The repetition was relentless, the imagery unmistakable, and the message clear. Egypt had not merely survived Kadesh, it had triumphed gloriously. Truth, in this case, was not erased. It was buried under monuments so vast that questioning them seemed sacrilegious. And thus, the Battle of Kadesh became something far greater than a military engagement. It became a lesson in how power controls memory, how authority shapes truth, and how a lie, when carved deeply enough into stone and repeated often enough across generations, can outlive the men who forged it. The battle itself may have ended in stalemate, but the narrative war had only just begun. And in that war, Ramses II would prove himself utterly undefeated. In the years that followed the Battle of Kadesh, something deeply unusual began to unfold. Something that, to a careful observer, spoke louder than any carved relief or triumphant hymn. Despite his supposed overwhelming victory, Ramesses II did not march north to finish the war, did not dismantle the Hittite power structure, and did not reclaim Kadesh, the very prize that had justified the campaign in the first place. Instead, Egypt's military presence in Syria quietly diminished, its influence receded, and its ambitions softened. This silence was not accidental. It was the silence of a power that had reached the limits of what force alone could achieve. For all the imagery of divine triumph broadcast across Egypt, the reality beyond its borders told a very different story, one in which the Hittite Empire remained intact, confident, and fully capable of resisting Egyptian expansion. From the Hittite perspective, the aftermath of Kadesh required no monumental exaggeration. Muwatalli II had done exactly what he intended. He had defended his territory, preserved his army, and demonstrated that Egypt could be stopped. His successors inherited not a shattered empire, but a stable one, still commanding respect throughout Anatolia and Syria. In Hittite records, the battle is mentioned without drama, without claims of annihilation or divine heroics, and without the obsessive repetition seen in Egyptian sources. This stark contrast is telling. Empires that truly win do not need to shout. Those that fear doubt carve their victories into every available surface. And as years passed, the balance of power between the two empires remained unchanged, further undermining Egypt's official narrative of dominance. Eventually, pragmatism triumphed over pride. Around 1259 AC, nearly 15 years after the clash at Kadesh, Egypt and the Hittite Empire did something unprecedented. They signed what is now recognized as the earliest known written peace treaty in human history. This treaty, preserved in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Akkadian cuneiform, was not the document of a defeated enemy begging for mercy. It was a treaty of equals. Both sides pledged non-aggression, mutual defense, and the extradition of political refugees, terms that only make sense when neither power can impose its will on the other. Most revealing of all, the treaty made no mention of Egyptian victory at Kadesh, no acknowledgement of Ramses' supposed divine slaughter of Hittite forces, and no concession of Kadesh itself to Egypt. The city remained under Hittite control, quietly confirming what the battlefield had already decided. The implications of this treaty are devastating to the myth of Kadesh as a glorious Egyptian triumph. If Ramses had truly crushed the Hittites as his monuments claimed, there would have been no need for compromise, no reason to recognize Hittite sovereignty, and no incentive to formalize peace. Instead, Egypt chose stability over conquest, diplomacy over war, and mutual recognition over domination. Ramses even went further, cementing the peace through dynastic marriage, taking a Hittite princess as his wife, a move that symbolized not victory, but reconciliation. For a pharaoh who portrayed himself as invincible, this was a quiet admission that force alone had failed. And yet, within Egypt, the story never changed. The release remained. The poems were recited. The lie endured. Generations grew up believing that Kadesh had been a moment of divine heroism, a testament to the unstoppable power of their king. This disconnect between internal narrative and external reality reveals something profoundly modern about the ancient world. Propaganda was not meant to convince enemies. It was meant to reassure the population, reinforce legitimacy, and preserve the illusion of cosmic order. Ramesses II may not have won at Kadesh, but he mastered something far more enduring than territory, the ability to control memory itself. In the end, the Battle of Kadesh did not reshape the map through conquest, but it reshaped history through narrative. It stands today as a chilling reminder that the first great fake news was not a rumor whispered in the shadows, but a monumental, state-sponsored fabrication carved into stone, sanctified by religion, and repeated until questioning it felt like heresy. And perhaps that is its most unsettling legacy. The realization that even at the dawn of recorded history, truth was already negotiable. And power, not accuracy, decided what would be remembered. The Battle of Kadesh did not end on the battlefield, nor with the signing of a treaty, nor even with the death of Ramses II decades later. Its true conclusion unfolded slowly, across centuries, as the version of events carved into Egyptian temples outlived both witnesses and contradictions. Stone does not argue, does not hesitate, and does not forget. And in the ancient world, stone was authority. To stand before colossal relief showing Ramses towering above his enemies, to read hymns describing divine fury and unquestionable victory, was to be confronted with a reality that felt immutable. Few could read, fewer still could challenge royal narratives, and even fewer would dare question a story sanctified by priests and gods. In this environment, repetition did what evidence could not. It transformed assertion into certainty. The lie did not need to be subtle. It needed only to be permanent. What makes Kadesh truly disturbing is not that a king exaggerated his achievements, such behavior was common, but that Ramses II systematized exaggeration into something recognizable even today: state-controlled narrative dominance. He ordered the same story carved again and again across multiple temples in multiple regions, ensuring that no alternative version could gain traction within Egypt. This was not memory. It was architecture of belief. By monopolizing the medium through which history was preserved, Ramesses ensured that future generations would inherit not the complexity of the past, but a simplified myth designed to serve power. The result was astonishing. For nearly 3,000 years, Ramesses II was remembered as the victor of Kadesh, while the truth remained fragmented, buried in foreign records and archaeological silence. Modern historians, armed with comparative sources, linguistic analysis, and material evidence, eventually dismantled the illusion, but only because history had moved beyond the monopoly of stone. The discovery of Hittite archives, particularly at Hattusa, revealed a parallel narrative devoid of triumphal language, exposing the imbalance between Egyptian spectacle and Hittite restraint. When these records were placed side by side, the conclusion became unavoidable. Kadesh was not a victory, but a narrowly avoided disaster, salvaged by chance and reframed through propaganda. The unsettling realization was not simply that ancient people were deceived. It was that they had no tools to resist the deception. And this is where Kadesh ceases to be ancient history and becomes a mirror. The mechanisms Ramesses used, control of media, repetition, divine justification, emotional storytelling, and the framing of survival as triumph, are not relics of the Bronze Age. They are alive, refined, and technologically amplified. The difference is not the strategy, but the speed and scale. Where Ramesses carved stone, modern power carves narratives into screens. Where priests legitimized the story, algorithms now do the same. Kadesh reminds us that the first casualty of war is not only truth, it is memory itself, reshaped to serve authority. In the end, the Battle of Kadesh stands as one of history's most valuable lessons precisely because it was not a decisive battle. It teaches that victory is not always decided by swords or chariots, but by who controls the story after the dust settles. Ramses II may have failed to conquer Kadesh, but he conquered something far more enduring: the perception of reality within his world. And perhaps the most unsettling thought of all is this. If the first great lie of recorded history could endure for 3,000 years, carved into stone and accepted without question, how many others still stand around us today, equally monumental, equally unquestioned, waiting for someone to look beyond the surface and ask whether the story we have been told was ever true at all? Long after the last chariot wheel broke and the last soldier left the fields near the Orontes River, the Battle of Kadesh continued to unfold in a realm far more enduring than warfare itself: the human mind. Wars normally fade into memory, blurred by time and replaced by new conflicts, but Kadesh refused to disappear because it was never allowed to end. It was preserved, curated, and endlessly reinforced as a lesson, a warning and a celebration, not of what truly happened, but of what power needed people to believe had happened. In this sense, Kadesh became one of the earliest examples of a perpetual victory, a conflict frozen in a single triumphant moment and replayed across generations until it lost all connection to reality. The battle did not need to be won again, it only needed to be remembered the right way. This manufactured memory had consequences. Within Egypt, the myth of Kadesh strengthened the ideological foundation of kingship, reinforcing the belief that the pharaoh, even when surrounded, betrayed, or overwhelmed, could never truly fail. This belief was not symbolic, it was political infrastructure. It justified taxation, conscription, monument building, and obedience, all under the assumption that Egypt's ruler was divinely protected and therefore infallible. To question Kadesh would have been to question the gods themselves, and so, a single battle, ambiguously resolved on the ground, became a cornerstone of imperial identity, shaping how Egyptians understood power, order, and their place in the cosmos. Outside Egypt, however, Kadesh lived a quieter, more truthful afterlife. Among the Hittites and their neighbors, it was remembered not as a miracle, but as proof that even the greatest empires could be checked. The restraint of Hittite records, their lack of theatrical triumph, speaks volumes about differing political cultures. Where Egypt relied on spectacle and divine narrative, the Hittites relied on balance, treaties, and pragmatic statecraft. History, in this case, survived not in monuments, but in clay tablets, fragile, easily broken, yet remarkably honest. It is one of history's great ironies that truth endured in the most perishable medium, while falsehood was carved into stone. The rediscovery of Kadesh in the modern era did more than correct a historical error. It challenged a deeply rooted assumption about ancient civilizations, the idea that propaganda is a modern invention. Kadesh proves the opposite. It reveals that the manipulation of narrative is as old as organized power itself, and that the technologies of deception evolve, but the logic remains unchanged. Control the story, and you control legitimacy. Control legitimacy, and you control obedience. Ramesses II may not have invented propaganda, but he perfected its large-scale institutional form. Ultimately, the true legacy of Kadesh is not military, political, or even historical. It is psychological. It teaches us that human beings are not persuaded primarily by facts, but by coherence, repetition, and authority. We accept stories that feel complete, that align with identity, and that are reinforced by symbols too large to ignore. The monuments of Ramesses still stand, imposing and magnificent, while the truth they conceal requires effort, skepticism, and comparison to uncover. And that is the final lesson of Kadesh. Truth survives, but only for those willing to search beyond what has been made permanent. The Battle of Kadesh never truly ended, because it never needed to. It succeeded not by destroying an enemy, but by redefining reality. And in doing so, it became immortal, not as a victory, but as a warning, echoing across millennia, reminding us that the most powerful battles are not fought with weapons, but with stories. There is a particular kind of silence that only monuments possess, not the silence of absence, but the silence of authority. When stone speaks, it does not invite debate, it demands acceptance. This was the final genius of Ramesses II. He understood, perhaps intuitively, that people do not remember what is most accurate, but what is most physically present. A colossal relief does not argue its case. It overwhelms the observer, compressing doubt beneath scale and permanence. In standing before these carvings, ancient Egyptians were not merely learning history, they were experiencing it, emotionally and spatially. absorbing a version of reality that felt as immovable as the walls that surrounded them. In this way, Kadesh became less an event and more an environment, a truth one lived inside rather than questioned. What makes this silence so powerful is that it appears neutral. Stone does not shout, does not threaten, does not explain. It simply exists, and in its existence, it implies inevitability. The reliefs of Kadesh do not say, "This is our version." They say, "This is what happened." And because alternative narratives were excluded from public space, doubt had nowhere to settle. This is how myths achieve longevity, not by eliminating truth entirely, but by denying it visibility. Truth, in the case of Kadesh, was not destroyed. It was displaced, pushed to the margins of memory, preserved only in distant archives and foreign tongues, waiting centuries for rediscovery. There is an unsettling continuity between that ancient silence and the modern world. Today, authority no longer relies on stone, but the principle remains unchanged. What dominates space, physical or digital, defines perceived reality. Algorithms replace monuments, repetition replaces ritual, and scale replaces evidence. Just as Ramesses flooded Egypt with a single story of Kadesh, modern systems flood attention with curated narratives until alternatives feel distant, implausible, or invisible. The medium has changed, but the psychology has not. Kadesh, therefore, is not merely a historical case study. It is a diagnostic tool for understanding how belief is manufactured. Yet, there is a quiet defiance embedded within the story itself. Stone endures, but it does not think. Clay tablets break, but they speak. The survival of Hittite records, accidental and fragile, reminds us that truth often persists in places power considers insignificant. It waits in footnotes, in comparative analysis, in the slow, unglamorous work of historians willing to distrust what seems obvious. The rediscovery of Kadesh's reality was not dramatic. It was methodical. And in that method lies hope. The idea that permanence is not the same as correctness, and that scale is not the same as truth. In the end, the Battle of Kadesh leaves us with a question more troubling than any military outcome. How many realities have we accepted simply because they were presented without alternatives? Ramesses II could not conquer Kadesh, but he conquered the silence that followed, filling it with his voice alone. To listen beyond that silence requires effort, skepticism, and humility, qualities as rare now as they were 3,000 years ago. And perhaps that is why Kadesh still matters, not because it was the first great lie in history, but because it revealed how easily lies can become eternal when they are given walls, weight, and time. In the end, nothing at Kadesh truly survived the way Ramesses II intended. Armies vanished, cities changed hands, empires faded into dust, yet the lie endured longer than any victory ever could. It endured because it was not built to convince enemies, but to calm fear, to preserve order, and to protect the fragile illusion that power must always be right. Stone cracked, temples eroded, gods were forgotten, but the mechanism remained, repeating itself wherever authority learned that controlling memory was easier than confronting truth. Kadesh reminds us that history is not only written by the victors, it is maintained by those who decide what is seen, what is repeated, and what is allowed to stand unchallenged. And the most unsettling realization of all is this: the Battle of Kadesh still has not ended, because every time a story is accepted simply because it is monumental, familiar, or comforting, its echo is heard once more, whispering the same ancient lesson, that truth does not disappear when it loses a battle, it disappears when no one dares to look past the stone.